Good morning, everybody. It's August 4th, 2026. Europe is standing at a genuine turning point in its weather right now, and I don't say that lightly. For the last several weeks, huge parts of the continent have been locked under what meteorologists are calling the fourth heat wave of the summer, a massive dome of high pressure that has parked itself over the middle of Europe and refused to leave. But the pattern behind that heat is now shifting, and shifting in a way that's going to change who gets hit hardest, how long this drags on, and what comes right behind it. Some parts of the continent are about to get a temporary break. Other parts are about to get hit even harder than they already have been. And underneath all of it sits a genuinely strange piece of ocean science that most people have never heard of. A cold patch sitting in the middle of the Atlantic that scientists believe is actually one of the hidden engines driving all of this. Here's what you need to know about what's coming. Let's start with the headline numbers, because they set the stage for everything else. Paris has come within a few degrees of its all-time July heat record. Madrid has pushed past 40 degrees Celsius, that's 105 Fahrenheit, multiple times in recent weeks. Wildfires have been tearing through the south of France, with flames burning through vegetation and tree trunks in towns like Cotignac as drought conditions worsen by the week. Europe is now, by a wide margin, the fastest warming continent on the planet, heating at roughly double the global average rate since the mid-1990s. And the pattern responsible for all of this, something scientists are calling an omega block, is now entering a new phase, one that's going to push the worst of the heat eastward while opening the door for storms and cooler air to finally muscle into parts of the west. That shift is what this entire video is about, because a change like this doesn't just mean different numbers on a forecast app. It means a completely different set of countries dealing with completely different kinds of danger over the next few weeks. So here's where we're headed. I want to walk you through exactly what an omega block actually is and why it's been sitting over Europe like a lid on a pot for weeks. Then I want to get into this cold blob in the Atlantic, because once you understand what that patch of water is doing, the entire summer starts to make a lot more sense. After that, we'll go country by country through what's actually about to happen over the next 3 weeks, because the forecast genuinely splits Europe into two very different stories, depending on where you live. Then we'll zoom out to the bigger global picture, because this heat isn't isolated to Europe. It's tied into a chain of atmospheric events stretching from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Indian monsoon. And I want to close by talking honestly about where this trend is actually heading over the next few years, because the scientists studying this pattern are not describing it as a one-off summer. If you've been living through this heat yourself, or if you've got family in Europe dealing with it right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how widespread this actually feels on the ground. And if you want to keep tracking how this pattern evolves week by week, go ahead and hit subscribe, because forecasts like this change fast, and I'll be breaking down every update as it comes in. Let's actually get into the mechanics of what's been cooking Europe alive this summer, because once you understand the shape of this weather pattern, the whole thing stops feeling random and starts feeling almost predictable. What's been sitting over the continent for the back half of July and into early August is what meteorologists call an omega block, named that because the shape it traces across a weather map looks almost exactly like the Greek letter omega, a high-pressure ridge sitting in the middle with two deep, low-pressure troughs carved out on either side of it, one out over the North Atlantic and another sitting over Russia. Picture it like a traffic jam frozen in place. Under normal summer conditions, weather systems move west to east across Europe in a matter of days. A hot spell builds, a cold front comes through behind it, rain clears the air, and the whole cycle resets. An omega block breaks that cycle completely. The high-pressure ridge in the center gets so strong and so wide that it essentially blocks the normal flow of the jet stream, forcing weather systems to detour around it instead of pushing through it. That's why this heat hasn't just been intense, it's been persistent, sitting over the same countries for days and sometimes weeks at a stretch instead of rolling through and moving on. And underneath that block sits something even stranger, a discovery that's honestly one of the more fascinating pieces of climate science to come out of this particular summer. Researchers have been tracking what's known as a cold blob, a stubborn patch of unusually cool water sitting in the subpolar North Atlantic, roughly south of Greenland and Iceland. While most of the world's oceans have been warming, this specific patch of water has been doing the opposite, staying persistently colder than it should be. Ocean and climate physicist Marilena Oltmans has described how that cold patch effectively acts as a guide rail for the jet stream. When you get a sharp temperature contrast between that cold patch of ocean and the warmer water and air around it, the atmosphere responds by making the jet stream wavier and slower than it would normally run. Instead of flowing in a relatively straight line west to east, it starts bending and buckling, and those buckles are exactly what create the conditions for a high-pressure system to park itself over Europe and stay there. Scientists connect this cold blob to a broader and honestly more concerning trend, a weakening of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the deep ocean current system that normally carries warm water north from the tropics. If that current system continues to slow down the way current research suggests it is, it could reshape regional climate patterns and sea levels far beyond just this one summer's heat waves. But that's a story for another day. For right now, the relevant point is simple. A slower, wavier jet stream is exactly the mechanism that lets a heat dome sit in place instead of moving through. And that mechanism has been active over Europe for weeks. Now here's the part that actually matters for what's coming next, because the pattern isn't just sitting still, it's moving. And the direction it's moving in tells you almost everything about who gets relief and who doesn't. Meteorological models are now showing what's being described as a slow eastward shift of the heat wave through the first 3 weeks of August. In the immediate window, roughly August 2nd through the 9th, the heat continues to bear down hardest across central and southern portions of the continent, with the drought that's already stressing soil moisture across the region expanding even further. Models are hot and dry across this stretch, with the eastward extension of the heat already beginning to creep into the western Black Sea region. Moving into the second window, roughly August 9th through the 16th, that eastward push accelerates. The hot, dry pattern holds through the middle of the month, but the center of gravity for the worst of it keeps sliding east, while some patchy rain finally starts showing up along the coastal northwest, the first real hint of relief for places that have been baking for weeks. Then in the third window, from roughly August 16th through the 23rd, the shift becomes unmistakable. Russia and Eastern Europe become the hottest zone on the map, while wetter weather starts moving into Germany and Poland. Meanwhile, Portugal and Spain, despite everything shifting east, are expected to remain hot and dry themselves, because the Iberian Peninsula sits close enough to that persistent Atlantic ridge that it doesn't get the same relief as the countries further north. Let's break that down by region, because I think this is the part people actually want to know, not the abstract atmospheric mechanics, but the actual answer to, is it going to cool down where I live? For the Iberian Peninsula, that's Spain and Portugal, the answer over the coming weeks is largely no. This region carries the greatest risk of prolonged heat out of anywhere on the continent, and it's expected to stay that way even as the broader pattern shifts. France sits in a similarly exposed position, along with Italy and the Balkans, all three expected to remain squarely inside the zone of highest heat risk through the middle of the month. Central Europe is where things get genuinely interesting, because that's shaping up to be the main collision zone between the hot air mass sitting over the continent and Atlantic or northern weather fronts finally starting to push in. That collision zone is exactly where you tend to get the most violent short-term weather, because when a mass of hot, moisture-starved air finally meets an incoming cold front, the atmosphere doesn't transition gently. It often erupts into severe thunderstorms, sometimes with damaging wind gusts, large hail, and flash flooding, precisely because the ground has been baked so dry for so long that it can't absorb sudden heavy rainfall. Northern Europe and Scandinavia are carrying an increased chance of warm anomalies themselves, though conditions up there are expected to stay considerably more changeable and unpredictable than the more locked-in pattern further south. And then you've got Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, and the wider Balkans, which are expected to remain exposed not just to heat, but to dry winds and severe thunderstorm lines as that eastward shift picks up steam through the middle of the month. One detail worth sitting with for a second is just how uneven the rainfall picture is shaping up to be across all of this. The warm signal in these forecasts, meaning the confidence that temperatures will run above normal, is genuinely strong, with basically every major forecasting model in agreement. The rainfall outlook is a completely different story, with far weaker agreement between models about where and how much rain actually falls. What that translates to on the ground is a pattern where drought and flash flooding can hit the exact same region within days of each other. That's not a contradiction. It's actually the signature of this kind of blocked, unstable pattern. Weeks of dry heat bake the ground rock hard and strip away soil moisture, and then when a storm finally does break through, the rain has nowhere to go. So instead of soaking in gradually the way it would on healthy, moisture-retentive soil, it runs straight off the surface, overwhelms drainage systems, and causes exactly the kind of flash flooding you'd associate with a completely different kind of weather emergency. So the practical warning coming out of this forecast isn't just expect more heat, it's expect more heat right up until you suddenly don't, and be ready for that transition to arrive as a violent storm rather than a gentle cool down. It also helps to understand why river levels and soil moisture keep coming up in every single one of these regional briefings, because those two measurements are doing a lot of quiet, unglamorous work behind the scenes of this whole story. Western, Central, and Southeastern Europe all went into this particular stretch of summer already carrying a deficit, meaning the ground and the rivers running through it hadn't recovered from the earlier heat waves before this next one arrived. That matters enormously, because a region with healthy soil moisture and normal river levels can absorb a hot spell without much drama. Crops keep pulling water from reserves underground, Rivers keep running high enough to support both ecosystems and human water use, and the ground itself acts like a buffer against the heat sitting on top of it. Take that buffer away, which is exactly what's happened after an already dry spring and an exceptionally hot start to summer in many areas, and even a moderate additional hot spell in August can land with a disproportionately harder punch than the raw temperature numbers alone would suggest. Low river levels also restrict hydroelectric power generation in several countries and limit the cooling water available for other power plants, which is one of the less visible ways a prolonged heat wave can quietly strain an entire region's electricity supply, even before you factor in the surge in air conditioning demand. There's a human health dimension to all of this that tends to get buried under the raw temperature numbers, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Heat doesn't kill evenly across a population. It concentrates its danger on specific groups: elderly residents living alone, infants and young children whose bodies regulate temperature far less efficiently than adults, outdoor workers who don't have the option of simply staying indoors during the hottest hours, and anyone already managing a cardiovascular or respiratory condition that heat stress can push past a dangerous threshold. Hospitals across the hardest-hit countries have been reporting the kind of pattern doctors dread during a prolonged heat wave: a steady climb in emergency admissions for heat exhaustion and heat stroke that doesn't spike dramatically on any single day, but keeps accumulating the longer the underlying pattern refuses to break. Public health officials across the affected countries have leaned heavily on the same core guidance throughout this stretch, scheduling anything strenuous for the cooler morning or evening hours, drinking water on a regular schedule rather than waiting until thirst actually sets in, and specifically checking in on elderly neighbors and relatives who might not reach out for help on their own, even when conditions inside their home have become genuinely dangerous. That last point matters more than it might sound, because some of the most tragic outcomes during past European heat waves involve people who were found only after the fact, having quietly succumbed to heat stress inside homes without air conditioning, sometimes over the course of several days, without anyone realizing something was wrong. Comparing this summer to Europe's past extreme heat events also puts the current pattern in useful perspective. The continent has now had 4 separate heat waves stack up across a single summer, which is itself an unusually high number by historical standards, and it's a pattern that lines up with exactly what climate researchers have been warning would become more common as the background warming trend continues to climb. Earlier heat wave events tended to arrive as isolated spikes, a hot week or two followed by a genuine return to more typical summer conditions. What's different this year is the persistence. 4 separate blocking events within a single season, each one building on soil and river conditions that never fully recovered from the one before it. That compounding effect is precisely why officials in several countries have been describing this summer's cumulative impact on agriculture, water supply, and public health as more severe than the peak temperature readings alone would suggest, because it's not any single day of extreme heat doing the damage. It's the sheer accumulated weight of an entire season spent with barely any real recovery period in between. I want to take a minute here to actually explain why persistent heat like this is so much more dangerous than a normal hot spell, because I think this gets lost in a lot of coverage. A heat wave that lasts 2 or 3 days is uncomfortable, but the human body and the built environment can generally absorb that kind of short-term stress. Buildings hold onto some cool from the night before. People can push through a few rough days, and infrastructure like power grids can handle short spikes in demand from air conditioning. The danger multiplies dramatically once heat persists for a week or more, which is exactly the pattern this omega block has been producing. Buildings never get a chance to shed the heat they absorbed the day before, so the base temperature inside homes and workplaces just keeps climbing night after night. Power grids face sustained, not spiking, demand, which raises the risk of failures at exactly the moment people need cooling the most. And the human toll compounds directly with duration, because it's not the first hot day that puts elderly people, young children, and anyone with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions at the greatest risk. It's the accumulated stress of day 5, day 8, day 12, of a body that never gets a real chance to cool down and recover overnight. That's precisely why researchers studying this exact pattern have been drawing a distinction between what they call Type 1 and Type 2 heat wave events. In the pattern researchers are calling Type 2, the jet stream shifts further north than usual, physically pushing storm systems away from Europe entirely, while large bends in that same jet stream work to maintain a broad high-pressure system locked in place over the continent, trapping hot air underneath it for extended stretches. That's essentially a technical description of exactly what's been happening this summer, and understanding it explains why this heat has felt so relentless compared to a normal summer hot spell that blows through and gives everyone a break. Now let's talk about the fires, because heat and drought on this scale never stay contained to a thermometer reading. They show up on the ground as burning hillsides and evacuated towns. Southern France has already seen wildfires ripping through towns like Cotignac, flames consuming vegetation and tree trunks, as the drought conditions that built up over the earlier heat waves this summer continue to worsen with every additional dry, hot week. And France is far from alone in this. As the drought expands across Central and Southern Europe through the first half of August, the risk of exactly this kind of fast-moving vegetation fire climbs right alongside it, because you've got the same ingredients driving fire risk anywhere in the world. Dry fuel that's been baking for weeks, low humidity, and, in a lot of these regions, wind patterns that can turn a small spark into an uncontrollable blaze within hours. Officials across the affected countries have been repeating the same basic safety guidance all summer, and it's worth repeating here because it genuinely matters. During periods of extreme fire danger, avoid lighting any fire near forests or dry vegetation, because something as small as a spark from machinery, a discarded cigarette, or even routine garden waste burning can be the spark that starts a fast-moving wildfire in conditions this dry. Before a thunderstorm arrives, especially one of the sudden, violent ones that tend to erupt where hot air collides with an incoming front, it's worth securing anything loose on balconies or in gardens and avoiding shelter under isolated trees, open water, or vehicles sitting in a low area that could flood within minutes rather than hours. Let's zoom out now, because as intense as this feels if you're living through it in Madrid or Rome or Bucharest, this European heat is not happening in isolation. It's one visible piece of a much larger global weather story unfolding across the northern hemisphere this year. Scientists studying the broader pattern have been tracing this year's European heat back to a chain of events stretching all the way from the tropical Pacific Ocean to South Asia. At the exact same time Europe has been baking under this blocked pattern, India's monsoon has been running below its long period average, with July rainfall tracking at around 94% of normal, even while temperatures across most of the country stayed above average. That's not a coincidence sitting on the other side of the globe. It's a reminder that heat and rainfall anomalies happening thousands of miles apart are frequently part of the exact same large-scale atmospheric circulation pattern, rather than isolated, unrelated events. Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, El Niño entered a phase of rapid strengthening back in July, and current projections from NOAA put the probability at around 97% that this event continues all the way into early spring of next year, with an 81% chance of it becoming a genuinely strong event by the final months of this year. El Niño reliably reshapes global weather patterns wherever it goes, and its rapid strengthening right now is one of the background signals feeding into seasonal outlooks that continue to favor above-average temperatures across most of Europe well into the autumn. And then there's the deeper trend sitting underneath all of this, the one that scientists keep coming back to no matter which specific heat wave or storm system they're analyzing in any given month. Europe is warming at roughly 0.56 degrees Celsius per decade since the mid-1990s, which is more than double the global average warming rate. That single number is the reason heat waves that would once have counted as rare, headline-making extremes are increasingly becoming a recurring feature of a normal European summer, arriving earlier in the calendar, lasting longer once they set up, and hitting with greater intensity nearly every year. Researchers have also found something specifically relevant to the blocked, stuck-in-place pattern we've been describing this whole time. Atmospheric patterns that lock in extreme weather, the exact heat domes and stalled flooding systems we've been talking about, have very nearly tripled in frequency since the 1950s. And the leading explanation researchers point to is human-driven climate change, altering the fundamental behavior of the jet stream itself. There's a specific mechanism behind that too, tied to something called Arctic amplification. The Arctic has been warming somewhere between 2 and 4 times faster than the global average, and that faster Arctic warming shrinks the temperature difference between the polar region and the tropics, which is the exact difference that normally drives the jet stream to move briskly and directly from west to east. Reduce that temperature gradient, and the jet stream slows down and develops much larger north-south dips and bulges in its path, precisely the kind of wavy, blocked pattern that lets a high-pressure ridge camp out over one region for weeks instead of moving through in days. That's the same broad mechanism scientists point to whenever they talk about storm stalling and intensifying instead of passing through the way they used to, whether that shows up as a heat dome parked over Europe or a slow-moving storm-dumping record rainfall somewhere else entirely. It's genuinely worth pausing on how connected all of this is across the entire Northern Hemisphere this particular year, because Europe's heat dome is not a standalone weather story, even if it's the one getting the most attention on this side of the Atlantic. As Europe fights record-setting wildfires driven by the aftermath of June and July's heat waves, forecasters are simultaneously flagging that yet another heat wave appears to be building in the immediate future across the United States as well. That's not two unrelated countries having unlucky summers at the same time. It's consistent with the same broader hemispheric pattern. A slower, wavier jet stream locking high-pressure ridges in place across multiple continents simultaneously rather than letting weather systems cycle through and move on the way they historically have. There's also a longer view worth taking here, because the El Niño event currently strengthening in the Pacific isn't expected to fade quietly once autumn arrives. Current projections point toward this becoming a genuinely strong event by the final months of the year. And, historically, strong El Niño winters tend to reshape storm tracks and temperature patterns across Europe well beyond the summer season that first drew everyone's attention to it. That means the version of this pattern playing out right now, heat building, shifting eastward, occasionally breaking into severe storms along the collision zones, isn't necessarily a story that wraps up neatly once September arrives. Forecasters are already watching how this year's El Niño signal might interact with the same weakened Atlantic circulation and Arctic amplification trends driving the current heat dome, and the honest answer at this point is that nobody has a fully confident read on exactly how those signals will combine once we're deeper into autumn and winter. What is clear is that the ingredients feeding this summer's extreme pattern aren't going anywhere on their own, and that alone is reason enough for anyone in the region to treat this as an evolving situation rather than a story that resolves the moment this particular heat wave finally cracks. So let's bring this back to the practical question everyone actually wants answered. What does the next 3 weeks genuinely look like? And what should you actually be watching for, depending on where you are? If you're in Spain, Portugal, southern France, Italy, or the Balkans, the honest answer is that meaningful relief is not close. You remain inside the zone carrying the greatest risk of prolonged heat straight through this window, and the drought and wildfire risk that's already visible on the ground in places like Cotignac is likely to keep expanding rather than easing off. If you're in Central Europe, watch for that collision zone behavior specifically, because that's where the hot, stagnant air currently in place is most likely to meet an incoming front and erupt into sudden, severe thunderstorm activity, the kind that can bring damaging wind and flash flooding with very little advance warning once that stagnant pattern finally breaks. If you're in Germany or Poland, keep an eye on the middle to back half of August specifically, because that's the window where models are showing wetter weather finally arriving as the broader heat dome shifts its center of gravity eastward. And if you're anywhere in Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, the Balkans, or Western Russia, brace for the opposite trajectory, because you're the region this eastward shifting pattern is heading directly toward, and the combination of heat, dry winds, and severe thunderstorm lines that's been battering Central and Southern Europe for weeks is exactly what current guidance shows moving your way through the second half of the month. There's also a broader lesson sitting inside this specific summer that I think is worth calling out directly, because it's easy to treat every heatwave story as its own isolated news cycle that fades once temperatures finally drop. What researchers are actually describing here isn't a single unlucky summer, it's a mechanism, a specific and increasingly well understood chain connecting a cooling patch of ocean water, a slower and wavier jet stream, and blocked high pressure systems that sit over one region for weeks at a time instead of cycling through in days the way they used to. That mechanism doesn't reset itself once this particular heat wave finally breaks. The same cold blob sitting in the North Atlantic, the same weakening ocean circulation pattern underneath it, and the same Arctic amplification driving the broader jet stream slowdown are all still going to be sitting there next summer and the summer after that, which is exactly why the researchers behind this year's analysis keep describing these omega block events and the extreme heat they produce as a recurring feature of the pattern now, not a rare exception to it. For farmers, water utilities, and emergency planners across the affected countries, that reframing changes the entire calculus of how you prepare. Treating an event like this as a freak occurrence means you rebuild, restock, and move on, assuming next summer will look more like the summers of a decade ago. Treating it as the new baseline, which is exactly what the underlying ocean and atmospheric data increasingly supports, means investing now in the kind of infrastructure that can actually absorb a repeat performance, deeper reservoir capacity to buffer against back-to-back dry seasons, power grids hardened against sustained rather than momentary demand spikes, and public health systems built around the assumption that a heat wave lasting a week or more is a routine summer event rather than a rare emergency. Several national meteorological agencies across Europe have already begun shifting their own long-range planning language in exactly that direction, treating the kind of blocked, persistent pattern behind this summer's heat not as an anomaly to be explained away, but as a scenario worth planning around every single year going forward. For everyday households, that same shift in thinking applies on a smaller scale too, keeping a basic heat plan ready before the next wave arrives, rather than scrambling once temperatures are already climbing. Knowing which room in the home stays coolest, having a way to check on elderly relatives or neighbors without relying on them to ask first, and treating a forecast showing a blocking pattern building as a genuine early warning rather than background noise to scroll past. What do you think is actually going to have the bigger impact going forward? This specific ocean cold blob mechanism everyone's now tracking, or the broader Arctic amplification trend sitting underneath practically every extreme weather story we've covered this year? And if you're somewhere in Europe right now dealing with this firsthand, I'd genuinely like to know what it's actually been like on the ground. Drop a comment and let me know where you are and how this summer has compared to past ones for you, because these forecast models only tell part of the story, and the on-the-ground reality from people actually living through it is usually the more useful half. If this breakdown helped make sense of what's actually driving this pattern, do me a favor and drop a like, share it with anyone you know who's been asking why this heat just won't let up, and go ahead and subscribe so you catch the next update as this eastward shift plays out over the coming weeks, because the forecast is still evolving day by day, and there's a lot more of this pattern still left to unfold before Europe gets anything close to a real lasting brow.